Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Erik Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover two books. The first is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, and the second is Reimagining Apologetics by Justin Ariel Bailey. These are books 22 and 23 from my 2023 reading list. Well, it is July, and July is my month for a break. So I started reading the great books this year. I'm starting the Great Books Project, and I expect it to last 10 years. But I've decided on a schedule for those 10 years, and I want to start each year just reading straight through the Bible, and I'll do a different version each year. So that'll be January and February. Then I'll go into what I'm calling semester one of the great books. That'll be March through June. And then July, I take a break, just read some fun books and books that I've had on my to-be-read pile for a while. And then August through November, back to the great books. That's semester two. And then December, I take another break where I just read books that kind of come up that aren't on the Great Books Project and perhaps give me a little bit of a mental break. Some of those great books can be quite intense. So that's where I am right now, and these are the first two books for July for this kind of to-be-read list. And the way I heard about these is I asked Andrew Peterson, he's a singer-songwriter, author, and really a entrepreneur who lives here in the Nashville area. And last year, I just asked him for a book suggestion. He's an avid reader. I like his books. I've covered some of his books in this podcast, and I like asking people what they read. So I asked him, and he suggested this pair of books, which was cool. And so the first was Gilead here, which is a novel, and then Reimagining Apologetics, which is a work of nonfiction. But I really like this idea of pairing books together, of reading perhaps one's a novel, another one is a nonfiction work that speak about each other. And so in this case, Gilead is the novel, and then Reimagining Apologetics is a book that actually references and talks about Gilead quite a bit. So that's why these are paired, and that's why I want to talk about both of them in this episode. So I'll spend a lot of the time covering Gilead, and then in the final segment I will cover Reimagining Apologetics. So Gilead is about, well, it's an epistolary novel, which means it's a novel built around a letter. And in this case, it's one super long letter from John Ames to his son. John Ames, in this work of fiction, was born in 1880 in Kansas, but then lives most of his life in Gilead, Iowa. In fact, just 2 years in Kansas and then the rest in Iowa. And this letter from the father to the son is neat in the sense that it comes in the latter part of John's life. And so he's writing this letter to his son, Robbie, who happens to be quite young. So there's a big age difference in father and son here. And in fact, towards the beginning of the book, I thought it was a grandfather writing to his son, but it's a father writing to his son. And he's kind of looking back over his life. So he's writing to his son. He mentions a lot, I wish you would have known me in my youth. I wish you would have known me at that time. But he's telling stories about his father, about his grandfather, and then just telling other parts of his life. And so it's neat. I really love epistolary novels. A few years back, I read Dangerous Liaisons. And that is one where there's a bunch of letters going on. So there's a bunch of different characters, but you're getting to know them through their letters, and you're seeing the same thing talked about by different characters. And it's just a really neat way to read a book or consume a novel in this format. And so I've already been entranced by books that are a result of letters going back and forth. And so this is a cool one just in the fact that it's one letter. It's one enormous letter. In fact, John Ames even calls it his diary at one point towards the end. So it's kind of like a diary / letter to to his son. And what's also neat is that John Ames, the letter writer in this case, is a preacher, and he comes from a line of preachers. And so part of what you're hearing is what his father encountered and what his grandfather encountered. And his grandfather was a preacher during the Civil War. So what does that mean? What kind of issues and things would he have had to address in his sermons? And you're talking about small town here. So these are people that they knew. And so these are people that have sent their sons to war. These are people who have lost their sons, and you're talking to them each week. You're giving a sermon each week. So there's just a lot going on in this novel. And then there's a specific part, a lot of parts about a man named Jack, and I'll get into that in segment 2. But that's kind of the structure of this book. This is my first work of fiction that I've read by Marilynne Robinson. Actually, the first thing I've ever read by her, because she's written some nonfiction as well. I enjoyed this thoroughly. It's a very good novel. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it reminded me of some other writers that I'll highlight in segment 2. But let me just get into quickly Reimagining Apologetics, and then segment 2 will cover Gilead, and then segment 3, Reimagining Apologetics. So Reimagining Apologetics is a work of nonfiction, and as the title would suggest, it proposes a new way of imagining apologetics. And it kind of uses a play on words, with reimagining largely consisting of engaging the imagination. So the word reimagining, but the way it's presented by Justin in this book is that reimagining engages the imagination. So well done on the title there. What is apologetics? Apologetics, it just means defending your faith or your beliefs. And it's usually thought of in the sense of of an intellectual endeavor. And so it has this idea that Justin calls later on in the book unassailable truth. So you're presenting ideas as like, these are the correct ideas. And it really is targeting the intellect. But let me read just a few quick pieces. One comes in the introduction here, and then one towards the end of the book. So really quickly, what Reimagining Apologetics does, what Justin Ariel Bailey is doing in this book, is looking at two authors in particular. One of them is George MacDonald, who I've covered at other points in this podcast. And the second one is Marilynne Robinson, who wrote Gilead. And so that's the connection here in this episode. But let me just read a few things here. The first is this: MacDonald and Robinson rarely make direct arguments. Rather, they thrust the reader into the midst of stories that breathe with the Spirit, embodying the Christian vision. They offer a more robust conception of faith's appeal to the human person, exploring the dynamics of faith and doubt, fraught with the messiness of human loves, longings, and laments. They demonstrate that in such matters, it is the imagination that is engaged first, as desire is drawn out through aesthetic experience, end quote. So a couple key points there. Just first off, that these books are fraught with messiness. You see that a lot in Robinson, and I just love that. It's real. Like you have the sense that these are real people. These are people you know. You may see yourself in a lot of these characters. But that second part too, that what matters and what is engaged first of all is the imagination of the person before the intellect. So engaging that imagination. So if we're looking at the title of this book again, Reimagining Apologetics. So if apologetics has that connotation of first engaging the intellect, if we are reimagining that, we're perhaps looking to first engage the imagination, and that's what Justin in this book says that authors Marilynne Robinson and George MacDonald do. So let me read one more quote towards the end of the book here. And here's this one. If the Christian faith is not simply a set of truths to affirm, but more fundamentally a way of seeing the world, then it has to do with with more than convincing our intellect. It also has to do with exercising our imaginations and cultivating imaginative dispositions. End quote. So again, just that this is kind of moving beyond just the arena of intellect and going more into the area of imagination. So reading stats, I like to share just how long these books take me, just so you know how long it might take you to read the book. So for Gilead, that's a 247-page book. It took me 6 hours, 49 minutes to read. That was over 2 days. So that was 124 pages a day, which is blows way past any other pages per day for any book this year. So I like to look at that just because it tells me how engaged I am in the book. If I'm reading 124 pages a day, I am into that book. I can't put it down. I'm sacrificing sleep. I want to finish it. So I finished this one in 2 days. I read it between July 1st and 2nd. For Reimagining Apologetics, that is also a 247-page book, same number as Gilead. I only read 147 of those pages, though, and I'll explain why in segment 3. And that took me 4 hours and 29 minutes to read. That was over a 4-day period, 37 pages per day between July 3 and July 6. And today is July 6, so I finished this book this morning. Now, let's go in deeper into Gilead in the next segment. Well, you know how you get a feeling when you read a book, and over time you get a similar feeling reading other books, and so in your mind you begin to equate those books with each other just because of the same kind of feeling you get while reading it. Well, I got a very similar feeling when I was reading Gilead as I did when I read Wendell Berry and when I've read George MacDonald in the past. In last year, I read back to back, I read a Wendell Berry book and a George MacDonald book. So the Wendell Berry book was Jayber Crow, and then George MacDonald book was Sir Gibby. And I randomized the order of my books, or at least I did at that point. And so for those two books to go back to back was pretty interesting, and they were very similar. That was the first time I had read Wendell Berry, and so I noticed a lot of similarities there. I covered that when I talked about those books last year, but I got that same feeling when I was reading Gilead, and I think what it boils down to is, first off, I want to be like the main characters, and that doesn't mean like the main characters are these beautiful, wonderful people in like a Hollywood sense, but there's a grit and there's a realness to the characters, and they love well. It can be messy, but they love well, and they see beauty in the mundane. And I think that's right there is the common feature that I see in these books. There's beauty in the mundane, and there's this appreciation of the simple and the beautiful of everyday life. And it just adds so much context, or that's not the right word. It just adds like layers of beauty to experience, to your experience, to look at things in a different way, to notice things. It has that impact on you. And so I saw that with Gilead, and I just love these types of books because it just gives you a good feeling of like an exalted feeling of wanting to live in that manner. It just kind of expands your world when you read these books. So I hope to read other Marilynne Robinson books, but I wanted to start with that, just in the similarity I noticed between Wendell Berry, George MacDonald, and Marilynne Robinson here. What's also interesting is that all three of those authors do a sort of series in how they write their books. So Wendell Berry with Jayber Crow, it's let me grab this book here, but it's called the Port William Membership. And so if you look at some of Wendell Berry's books, it takes place in the Port William Membership, but it's from different vantage points. So in Jayber Crow, you read about Hannah Coulter. You read about some of the other people who you will notice that those are titles other books by Wendell Berry. So from what I understand is going on, you're getting the vantage point of these different characters, but they all live in the same place. They're all within the same world. And so the same thing with George MacDonald. You read Sir Gibby and you read about Donal Grant. And so there's another book, Donal Grant. And so you're getting the story from that character's vantage point. And so same with Gilead here. Gilead is one of a series, and so from what I understand, you're kind of getting different vantage points, but within the same world that you've been reading about. And I love that idea. It's similar, I was kind of thinking of like Narnia and Lord of the Rings, to where those books are actually packaged as series. So you buy the 7-book Narnia series, or you buy the 6-book, which usually is in 3 volumes, Lord of the Rings, and you buy that together because the world is there, and they kind of somewhat build off each other. Lord of the Rings does, I think, more than Narnia, but there's similarities there. But with MacDonald, Berry, and Robinson, the books are, at least how I see them, they're not packaged together in that way to where you buy them all together as part of the series. Yet they all kind of take place in that world. I don't see that a lot with other authors. I know it exists, but like if you just think of kind of the main authors, you're not seeing a lot of their novels take place in the same area. So I usually don't talk about the feel a book gives me, but in this case, it just reminded me of the feeling of these other books. And Ashley, who works at Landmark Booksellers, where I'm the business manager, she mentioned that Hannah Coulter, the book by Wendell Berry, could also be very closely connected to Gilead here, in the sense that Hannah Coulter, I guess, is a book about more the end of life, where so is Gilead in the sense of this letter that's being written to his son is the end of life. So I do want to read Hannah Coulter at some point, but if you've read that, maybe you can comment to me by email or something and let me know if that is the case, if there is kind of a deeper connection there. Next up, I want to highlight one of the people written about in this book, and his name is Jack, but his full name is John Ames Boughton. And John Ames is the name of the main character, the person who's writing this letter. And so Jack here is his namesake. And so John Ames, the main character, has a best friend, and that friend has a son and names his son after John. But that son goes by the name of Jack. But there's this deep connection between the two characters, and they have the same name, but there's a pull between the two of them. And so there's a lot written about Jack in this letter to John's son. And towards the end of the book, there's a section where you get to learn a lot about Jack. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And actually there's not a whole lot of good in it. There's a lot of bad in the ugly. And I thought it was really interesting how, because you're reading about this and you're kind of thinking to yourself, why? Well, first you get engrossed in the story, but then at least I was thinking, why is he writing all this to his son? This man is a preacher. There should be, some level of privacy into what Jack has told John. So why is he saying all this to his son? And he addresses that at the very end of this long section of just kind of really awful things about Jack. And he says this: "You might wonder about my pastoral discretion writing this all out. Well, on one hand, it is the way I have of considering things. On the other hand, he is a man about whom you may never hear one good word, and I just don't know another way to let you see the beauty there is in him." End quote. And so, kind of in the midst of this just awful story about him, there is some light there as well. And so John wants to be sure that his son sees that and can notice that in a person that he may never ever hear a good thing about that person going forward. Again, small town, everyone knows what happened, everyone knows what this man did, and the father to his son wants to share the good thing that about him. Last thing I wanted to highlight in Gilead is just some quotes that really struck me as I read them. And the first is on the topic of the afterlife. So this man is writing a letter. He knows he doesn't have much time left on earth. And so there's a lot of thoughts about the afterlife and what comes next for him. So I wanted to highlight 3 quotes in particular here. The first is this: "In eternity, this world will be Troy. I believe in all that has passed here will be the epic of the universe, the ballad they sing in the streets. Because I don't imagine any reality putting this one in the shade entirely, and I think piety forbids me to try." End quote. So what he's talking about here is in eternity, in the next life, this world will be like Troy. So there will be a remembrance, there will be a recognition of this world, but it will be as us in Troy and reading about Troy and that ancient civilization. So it was there are stories from there, but that will be an epic that we know, and it's sung in the streets, but it's just a very small part. So that's kind of the first thing that he mentions. The second comes on page 103, and he says this: "I've always wondered what relationship this present reality bears to an ultimate reality. I've always wondered what relationship this present reality bears to an ultimate reality." End quote. So just, what is the connection? Are any of the desires that he has, are those pointing to something else? And then this one, page 147, "Mainly I just think about the splendors of the world and multiply by 2. I'd multiply by 10 or 12 if I had the energy, but 2 is much more than sufficient for my purposes." End quote. So what he's doing there is thinking of what does he think heaven is going to be like? And it kind of ties back to that other quote I just read. But he thinks of it just as like the best of this world, the splendors of this world, and multiplying that by 2. And maybe it's more of a multiplication than that, but he just goes with thinking of that, of multiplying by 2, the greatest things of this earth. Thought those were cool things. The second one here, I thought this is John, the letter writer, writing about Jack, who I just mentioned previously. And I thought this was just a good description for a lot of kind of what's wrong with the world right now. Young Boughton just sat there grinning, and young Boughton, again, is Jack. That's one thing that has always been strange about him. He treats words as if they were actions. He doesn't listen to the meaning of words the way other people do. He just decides whether they are hostile and how hostile they are. He decides whether they threaten him or injure him, and he reacts at that level. If he reads chastisement into anything you say, it's as if you had taken a shot at him, as if you had nicked his ear. End quote. So that was a good description of how first the difference of listening to the meaning of the words or listening to or treating words as if they were actions. And you just see that just in how quickly people can get angry and how they're shouting back and forth on so many different platforms and things. I think that's a good distinction there of treating words as actions as opposed to listening to the meaning of words. And then the last quote I want to highlight here is towards the end of the book. "It is one of the best traits of good people that they love where they pity. And this is truer of women than of men. So they get themselves drawn into situations that are harmful to them. I've seen this happen many, many times. I've always had the trouble finding a way to caution against it, since it is, in a word, Christ-like." End quote. The reason this stuck out to me is that I think in contrast to what is so often you hear in modern times in podcast episodes and self-help books and all that kind of thing, where they say to get rid of people in your life that are dragging you down, that's just going to drag you down. And that is just not very, you wouldn't find that attitude in the Bible. And that's what I like about pointing out here. It's one of the best traits of good people, that they love where they pity. And he wants to warn against doing that, because he knows what's going to happen, but he can't. As a preacher, he can't, because as he says at the end, it's, in a word, Christ-like. All right, that does it for Gilead. Next segment here, final segment, I will cover Reimagining Apologetics. Well, I only read half of this book, and the reason I did so is because the author suggested that as an option. So I read through the introduction, and in the introduction, Justin says this: "I should say that I've endeavored to write part 2 so that it could stand on its own. Those readers who begin with part 1 will see my working categories more clearly, but I have restricted more of the explicit connections to the first 3 chapters to the footnotes. Readers who are most interested in George MacDonald and Marilynne Robinson, or who simply want to see imaginative apologetics at work, may desire to begin with part 2. End quote. So I took him up on that. That's really why I picked up this book, is for the pairing with Gilead, and I wanted to read the sections about George MacDonald and Robinson, and then kind of how they tied in with the title of the book, Reimagining Apologetics. So after reading the intro, I did skip part 1. I jumped right to part 2, and then there is I believe there's a conclusion kind of at the end. So yeah, there's part 1, part 2. I skipped part 1, so I will be talking about part 2 in this episode. And to start off, I want to give the definition that Justin gives towards the end of the book here. This is the essence of reimagining apologetics. It blesses by embodying a Christian vision of the world, fallen yet still created and loved by its creator, who has not abandoned it. Even when the vision is not embraced, the very act of blessing has the capacity to enlarge the imagination with a sense of what it feels like to inhabit such a world. End quote. Now, that idea of blessing, if you've read Gilead, should sound familiar. There's a very vivid scene in this book with Jack, who I mentioned in segment 2, and that idea of blessing. And so that's what Justin is hitting on here. One other quote. This comes on page 227. "The culture war can only proceed on the assumption that there is such a thing as a space where God is not present. But if the world remains saturated with God's presence and address, despite our attempts to deny or shut it out, Christian engagement with culture becomes more a matter of discernment than defense." End quote. So let me back up here just for a second. The assumption of this book in Reimagining Apologetics is that God is present. If he's not, then the culture war can proceed. But if he is present, then the idea of talking about faith or writing about faith is to awaken what is there, and to reveal what is there, either within the person. That could be revealing the beauty that is already there, that exists around us, writing about those things, talking about those things. And so that's how these authors, George MacDonald and Marilynne Robinson, tie in with Justin's idea here. It's not this intellectual pursuit where you're trying to say all the truths that have to be adhered to, but it's more of there's a presence here. Let's reawaken that. Let's reveal that. And so the way that it's spoken of in this book is that for George MacDonald, it is a waking things up. George MacDonald, Justin says, is he awakened the religious sense. And the title chapter about George MacDonald is Waking Things Up. For Marilynne Robinson, her idea was to reveal the religious depth of experience. And in that chapter, it's called Revealing a Wider World. So again, MacDonald waking things up, Marilynne Robinson revealing a wider world. I just love that that context and framework for when you do approach these authors. It's just kind of a good thing to keep in mind. So what George MacDonald, he there's a sense of he's waking things up. In his writing, he is attempting to wake things up. Marilynne Robinson, she is attempting to reveal a wider world. So let me start with MacDonald and go into a few things with him, and then Robinson, and then I will tie in another author who is kind of a bridge between these two. So page 125. It is not, after all, the intellect, but the heart that is the site of the spiritual struggle. So this is MacDonald's ideas here. And so he's not writing in a way that only goes after the intellect, but is going after the heart, because that's where he says the spiritual struggle is. Next up, nature is tenfold brighter in the sun of righteousness, and my love of nature is more intense since I became a Christian, if indeed I am one. This is a letter that MacDonald wrote to his father about his conversion, and I love that. And I've heard that said when people have come to faith. One thing that becomes immediately apparent is they start noticing trees. They start noticing leaves on the trees. Like they have driven by these trees, or they've walked by these trees for however many years, but then there's a shift to where something mundane as a tree comes to life. And so I loved that he said that nature is tenfold brighter in the sun of righteousness, and my love of nature is more intense since I became a Christian, if indeed I am one. Next up, MacDonald suggests that love for God is found by deepening rather than displacing human desire, end quote. I think this is a really key point and something that I enjoy seeing in works. There may be an idea that religion or faith is the killing of desire, the killing of fun, or just letting the inhibitions go. But what MacDonald suggests here is that love for God is found by deepening human desire. So it's going deeper into those desires, maybe asking, why are those there? Why do I have these desires within me? Next up, page 150. In these quotations, we find the basic shape of MacDonald's strategy. He begins with the assumption that the things we love have a source beyond themselves, that our deepest longings are not lies, end quotes. That ties in with that previous one of it's a deepening of human desire, not a displacing. And that is based off the assumption that there is a source beyond the things that we love, and that our deepest longings are not lies. Read one more thing about MacDonald here, something that he said. A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean, end quote. I love that. And I think that's true even of once an artist has created a work of art and they hear other people discussing it, there are things in that work that they didn't intend, they didn't realize were there, but that's kind of the sign of a good work of art, that it must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. So that's a cool idea. So now let's go into Robinson a little bit, some things that Justin Ariel Bailey wrote about Robinson's work. There's sections for most of her main works of fiction, and so there was a section about Gilead as well, and that was very cool to read after having read the novel. But here's just a few things about that, either about Robinson or things that she wrote. So here's the first. The driving assumption in all of her fiction, as Hungerford writes, is that ordinary people have rich and complicated interior lives, that they embody a silent discourse of thought that, if we knew its voice, would astonish us. End quote. Again, that just goes into that idea of the simplicity, maybe on the outset, or what comes to eye, but actually there's this profundity. There's a deep beauty in the mundane, and so even an ordinary person, you look at an ordinary person's life, and you dig deep and there's a rich and complicated interior life there. There's this silent discourse of thought that if we knew its voice would astonish us. I love that, and just it really encapsulates a lot of what you read in Gilead, and just kind of the profundity, the dynamic, the beauty of what's going on. Last thing here is about beauty. Beauty is, as Robinson writes, a conversation between humankind and reality. And we are an essential part of it, bringing to it our singular gifts of reflection and creation. Beauty is a conversation between humankind and reality, and we are an essential part of it, bringing to it our singular gifts of reflection and creation. End quote. Again, you see that in her works. I've only read one of them, but you see that in Gilead. And so I love book pairings like this where it kind of helps you think through what you just read. And so I enjoyed that part of this one. So let's close out with the bridge. So what's a bridge between these two authors? Well, Justin in the book highlights another author that you probably know well, and that is C.S. Lewis. And so C.S. Lewis is the bridge in the sense that he wrote books on apologetics, but then he also wrote books awakening the imagination, books like Narnia and other works of fiction. And George MacDonald awakened Lewis's imagination. And so we probably wouldn't have the C.S. Lewis we know were it not for George MacDonald. Had a tremendous impact just in terms of his faith, but then also what George MacDonald wrote. It impacted both Lewis and Tolkien, and a number of other authors as well. And I just kind of wonder if Lewis awakened that same thing in Robinson, if that was, time-wise, if that was, because George MacDonald was 1800s, Lewis was mid 1900s, and then Robinson is still alive and writing. So was C.S. Lewis that connection point between George MacDonald and Robinson as well? I hope to read more Robinson, and so maybe I will get that answered. If you know that answer, if she was impacted by Lewis, I'd love to learn that as well. And you can email me. That'd be wonderful. So to recap, Gilead, read it if you have not read it. It's a relatively short book, and it's one where it elicits that desire in you. It just makes you want to experience life in the way that these characters do. And again, it doesn't mean that it's just all like everything is good and just, everybody's always happy and all that. It's not like that at all. It's real life, but there's beauty in it. There's beauty in the struggle. There's beauty in the pain. That struggle is what leads to the beauty. And it's nice to read books like that. For Reimagining Apologetics, what that sought to do was to tie these two authors together, George MacDonald and Marilynne Robinson. And it made me wonder if Justin, the author, has read much of Wendell Berry, because I think he would find a lot of these ideas there as well. In my mind, I'm gathering a list of authors. So after I finish the Great Books project, what I want to do is take in different authors that I just want to read all their works and just kind of go year by year. So, for instance, I want to take 1 year and just read all the works by C.S. Lewis, another year and read all the works by Wendell Berry. Well, I've just added another author to that list, and that will be Marilynne Robinson. I want to take a year and read all of her fiction and nonfiction works. I really enjoyed reading her this time with Gilead. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. I asked a few questions during the podcast episode there, and if you know those, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at erik@booksoftitans.com. I spell my name with a K, so that's ERIK @booksoftitans.com. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and the website is stock full of resources to help you find the best books and to create your own reading list. So I will be back in a week or two, and until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.